Tamarin may not be a perfect game, but it immediately captivated me. As a rare fan in the 90s, Tamarin is a game that felt like it was made personally for me. It's framed as a spiritual successor to one of my favorite games of all time, and was worked on by some of my favorite developers. That alone was enough to get me stoked, but when I learned that Jet Force Gemini was used as inspiration for only half of the game, and that there was additionally a 3D platformer in the style of Banjo-Tooie that made up the other half, I was simultaneously overjoyed and disappointed. The reason for that is that as much as I love Banjo, Jet Force Gemini is a game that's even less likely to see a follow-up. It was an original IP with amazing visuals and production value for the time that blended humor and gore and contrasted lightheartedness with the threat of extinction. It had gigantic boss fights, combat that was tough as nails, and a wide variety of weaponry that made it fun to constantly experiment. In the end, it was hampered by only a couple of poor design choices, which ultimately held it back from becoming universally renowned. The unfortunate part, though, is that because of those choices, and its relatively low sales, it's now unlikely to ever receive a sequel. And that's why I'm so thankful that Tamarin exists. It feels like the sequel that I was never going to see. The enemies are similar, the weapons are similar, even the progression gating is similar. In combat, enemies explode, weapons go flying, and collectibles appear, just the same as before. In fact, playing it felt exactly as I expected a reboot to feel. It was a third-person shooter with slightly frustrating controls, and a wonderful contrast of cutesy and the chaotic. It was everything I'd hoped it would be, and the joy of blasting insects into smithereens was palpable. It's a gameplay loop that holds up extremely well. Before I continue gushing too much further, I feel it's necessary to point out that I encountered a number of bugs while playing the game, and not just the kind that I was intended to. I understand that this game was made by a very small team of developers, and because of that, the amount of polish here can't possibly compare to games with much larger budgets and development studios. I'm okay with that, and don't hold it against the game. I knew what I was getting. I noticed things like geometry that didn't fully line up, music that would occasionally forget to play, cutscenes that were triggered from the wrong locations, cutscenes that highlighted the wrong things, and even a spot where I was able to soft lock the game. I don't mention these issues because I want to sit here and nitpick every flaw that I happen to find. I mention them because these were things that I was able to recognize as bugs, not design choices. And for the most part, they didn't hinder the enjoyment I was having with the game. However, with as many bugs as there are, it's hard for me to say definitively one way or another if everything I'm about to discuss was intentional. It's what I experienced though, so I'm going to treat it like it was. Going back to gameplay, the deeper I invested into it, the more something about it began to feel empty or hollow. It took a bit to pinpoint what it was exactly because so much of it felt the way that I imagined that it should. And that's when it hit me. It had to do with just how easy it was. I can't tell you how many times I've died in combat in Jet Force Gemini. That game is tough as nails. I can tell you how many times I died to enemies in Tamarin though. 0. The combat is fun, but there was just too much ammo everywhere. Every enemy that you kill drops ammo, meaning that if you can kill them with few enough bullets, you'll always end up with more than you started with. Additionally, between the two primary weapons in the game, the pistol and the machine gun, there's tactically no reason to ever switch between them. They both shoot the same bullets. It's just that one has a faster firing rate. So as long as ammo is available for the machine gun, I haven't been able to figure out a reason why not to use it. I'd hoped for more strategy, more variety to the weaponry, or really any more of a reason to mix up the gunplay, but sadly there wasn't anything like that. One last note about the weapons is that this lock here was one of the biggest teases in the game for me. This is a progression lock that can't be opened until you're able to fire bullets into it fast enough. It's immediately apparent that the pistol isn't fast enough for this, and that it will require the machine gun. The same progression lock was in Jet Force Gemini, and offers the ability to have branching paths that are only available once certain requirements are met. In this case, the machine gun and ammo. The problem here, for starters, is that the machine gun needed to bypass this gate is given to the player only a few steps away. It doesn't take a lot of effort. Secondly, this is the only gate of its kind in the game. On one hand, it could be argued that it's pointless to have more of these gates introduced after you have the tool necessary to open them. But then again, opening progression gates is just fun. Besides, they could have been used as a sort of ammo drain to make sure that nobody ever ended up with having too much ammo, like I did. Overall, I just would have liked to have seen this used a couple more times. Now, switching gears for a moment, the biggest complaint people have with Jet Force Gemini, bar none, is the late game tribal hunt. In order to reach the final boss, all of the adorable tribals must be collected. They're hidden across each of the 15 worlds, and there's no map to help you find them. To add insult to injury, if something were to happen to any of the tribals, either accidentally or on purpose, you have to start that region all over again. To say that it was a painful process would be to put it lightly, but the reward for doing it was a boss fight and a story twist that has stuck with me for 20 years. Tamarin, thankfully, doesn't have any tribals. In their place, it does have adorable little birds. And the difference between them is, it's really not much. Thankfully, rather than gatekeeping the end of the game wholesale, the amount required to actually complete the game is much more reasonable. Many are sitting in the critical path and are difficult to miss, but in several instances, they do test your reflexes, forcing you to rescue them before they're assassinated. Here's an example. I entered a room and noticed a bird on the right, nearby a proximity mine, being threatened by a drone. Easy, I thought. Take out the drone, navigate to the bird, easy peasy. The problem was, a bullet missed and triggered the mine, which killed the bird. In the moment, I couldn't tell if it was my bullet or the enemy's, but I was devastated. I was in the end game, and this was the first time this had happened to me, so I did what any self-respecting player would do. I turned around, left the area in order to reset it. When I returned, I was horrified. The little birdie stayed dead. I didn't expect the game to ask me to live with my consequences, so perhaps that's why it shocked me as much as it did. There's no question that not having to collect every bird in the game is a huge improvement. Having real consequences for failures is fantastic, and feels like a worthy compromise. It means that I have the option to start over and go for that perfect run, but I'm not forced to. And hey, more options are always better than fewer. Now I could go on and on detailing why splattering bugs is as much of a satisfying experience in the year 2020 as it was back in 1999, but the truth is, this type of gameplay only makes up half of the game. The other half is a straight-up collectathon platformer. For several regions in the game, guns are taken away, and as a compromise, mobility is increased. Mid-air dashes, backflips, jump boards, and more are all part of the moveset, and very much to my surprise, it all feels great to perform. I've played many 3D platformers, and only a select few have ever felt as smooth to control as it does here. Instead of collecting power stars, jiggies, or inanimate objects like that, the main collectibles here are dragonflies. Coins and notes are replaced with currents. Levels are fun to explore and are all interconnected. Finding pathways from one area to another is also really enjoyable, even if it's underutilized and ultimately unnecessary. Overall, it's a very competent platformer, and at times it borders on fantastic. It does a good job of mixing the action-packed pace of the shooting sections, even if a platformer wasn't what I was originally looking for in this game. There are, unfortunately, just a few spots that come close to spoiling it all. For starters, moving around the game is a joy, and completing jumps with the dive feels amazing. Perhaps too good, actually. That's because few to none of the platforming sections in the game were designed around the jump distance of the dive. Best I can gather is that it was intended for attacking only. This means that I frequently found myself overshooting jumps. Usually it was just a matter of redoing a small section of the level and trying again. But there was one major exception. Towards the tail end of the game, there's a section of cliff face that must be navigated in order to progress. It's traditional platforming stuff and nothing too scary, but rather than a gentle reset if you fail, you get booted back to the last save point. For me, it was quite a distance away, and it took a fair bit of time to get back there after a failure. Between the camera being difficult to control, the rounded shape of the ledges, not to mention the cliff face itself, which stopped my forward momentum more than once. This was a massive difficulty spike in relation to the rest of the game, even if it doesn't look like it. I got so fed up with this section that I actually went out of my way to find a sequence break around it, and I'm lucky I found one. There are a couple of other objectives towards the end of the game with extremely tight tolerances too, like races, where there's roughly a second of wiggle room. Thankfully, these aren't necessary in order to be able to complete the game. They're a great illustration of the scattershot difficulty though, as there are moments that are simply way too easy, juxtaposed with large difficulty spikes. They mostly come from an expectation of precision platforming, which the rest of the game doesn't prepare you for, nor expect that from you as a player. For me, ignoring the movement benefit that the mid-air dive provides was a large missed opportunity. Underutilizing progression gates was also a missed opportunity. In fact, in both gameplay types, great ideas are presented and then are discarded too quickly before they've been properly iterated on and explored. Yet somehow, I thoroughly enjoyed my roughly 6-hour playtime, and I'm really glad that I took this journey. Jet Force Gemini is a game that had all the right foundations, but in the end, it overstayed its welcome. Tamarin, in contrast, is a game that also has all of the right foundations, but in its case, it's over too soon. long before any of the ideas had been fully explored. I recognize that it's hard to separate this game from the nostalgia that I have, but for what it's worth, Tamarin struck a chord with me. I loved playing it, and I'm really curious to see what this team is able to do with the follow-up. Hopefully, it'll be sooner than 20 years this time. You know what to do.